all, welcome to our day today. If you're here for blended finance lessons in from Big Society Capital, then you've made it to the right place. I am Christy Fairholm-Mader, and I'm with Thrive Impact Fund. And I'm really excited today to have Wren from McConnell Foundation here to have a conversation with James Burrows from Big Society Capital. So before we start, I just want to take a moment to recognize that I am coming to you today from the Algonquin-speaking territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations here on the west coast of Canada, also known as Victoria, BC. And I feel incredibly privileged to get to live, work, and enjoy spring over here. So not sure how it is in the rest of Canada and internationally, but we've got flowers all came out and it was an amazing and beautiful walk this morning. I wanted to note that this series is part of a wider series or conversation that we've been having in Canada about how we can mobilize catalytic and blended capital and how we can do that, as a way of filling gaps within the social finance ecosystem, and how we can better sort of support and generate amazing outcomes in terms of good projects that are taking place, but may not fit, traditional financing approaches, which is why we're going to talk to blended capital, and I've heard so much from other folks as well along this journey. And this series has been put together in partnership between the Ontario Trillium Foundation, Thrive Impact Fund, and Spring, and we're lucky to have both Tracy and Keith on the call today, so they're here to answer questions in the chat. And I really want to encourage that as we go through the webinar and have the conversation, that as you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to ask questions to James and to Wren, and we'll carry on from that way. So, and this specific webinar is building on a conversation that we had in person about a month and a bit ago. And so we first started by having a webinar with Ani, Patent Power, and got to talk about, blended and catalytic capital there. We came together as a group of about 85 people to really talk about how do we mobilize blended capital? What does that look like? What is catalytic capital? And you can see from these visuals that I put up on the screen that it was really robust. It really talked about all the different things about how we create alternative returns, what's blended finance look like, how do we collaborate, how do we blend capital both within organizations. And when we talk about blended capital, from grants to financing to bonds to equity, like really thinking about that whole range of capital that we can, and how do we blend within our own organizations as well as in partnership with others. And you can see this is our day 2. We had sort of high-level systems finance conversation, and then we really landed it in tools and approaches and case studies and actions. So we want to continue to build on that, and that's why we've been really, really thankful to have Wren and James come and share and talk about their experience with blended and catalytic capital. And so I'd like to introduce currently first Wren. She is going to be our interviewer. So we'll have James make a presentation, and then Wren will be able to interview. So Wren is an investment leader working to create positive change through impact-driven finance. As an investment director with the McConnell Foundation, she's led the creation and implementation of a new strategy to transition the endowment to 100% impact investments by 2028. And prior to McConnell, Wren was an investment director at Big Society Capital, where she co-led the impact property investment work, helping to demonstrate the significant role that private investment can play in tackling the UK's housing affordability crisis. So really pleased to have Wren here. And I'd like to introduce James. So James currently looks after the social lending team at Big Society Capital, spanning the work, including blended finance, social banks, and charity bonds. He's also actively involved in shaping and building out the practice, looking at investing for systems change and helping to shape learning from the best of what others are doing in this area. In BSC's previous business plan cycle, he also led on the places strategy, looking at ways social investment can play a role to make places which provide opportunities for the people who live there. So welcome both. I'm going to stop my share at this point and pass it over to James to carry on and share some of the lessons that he's learned in his work with Big Society Capital.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody for having me here. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Give me 1 second, and then I'll get into it. Tech challenges, etc. Okay. So can you see something that says Big Society Capital on? Perfect. In which case we're away. And if I change, we just do a practice. If I change that, can you see that change? All right, amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me. As I said, and I was reflecting to some of the team who've invited me here today, and Wren, an old colleague and friend who we've known each other a number of years now, and it's great to be able to connect in this space. But that, as much as us sharing out some of the lessons that we've been learning over the last 10, 12 years in some of this space in various ways, this is as much about us receiving in and getting things reflected back and having questions and having our thinking and our approaches challenged. Um, we we are fools if we think we're the absolute market leaders and experts in everything that we're doing in this very complex space. And so, hearing all of this stuff and seeing all of the great work and the way that you're talking about it across the series so far is absolutely also why I'm here. So I thank you for that privilege as well. So quick intro here and what I'm going to cover, and then hopefully we'll get into this in as much as a conversation as possible. Hopefully I'll leave lots of time for Wren, you to pick up some conversations of gaps that I leave in various ways, or things that we can then go deeper on, and then similarly anything from the rest of you guys here today. So I'll quickly cover who we are and what we do, so you know why on earth I'm talking to you. Second thing is I'll look at our approach and how we work, including some of our wider market building work. I'll pick out some general lessons that we've done from some of that stuff in case that's useful. And then specifically, and I'll try and spend most of our time, given the relevance here, on some of our work around blended finance and pulling out some specific lessons around some of that stuff, and then how we've started to try and apply some of those in various ways. And I'll try as much as possible to give real life examples of this, but anything I don't manage to do here, pick up and ask questions as we go. So that's absolutely fine. So without further ado, I'll start going through, and I'm not going to go through everything on each of these slides. Don't worry. I can share these afterwards with all of you. So there'll be a lot of this that's just that's detail that I'm not going to talk to, but is a bit of a jumping off point. So BSC, who are we and what do we do? So the ABCs of BSC, since 2012, we've been helping to connect more money to impactful organizations and projects based in the UK. We're broadly impact agnostic, so we work across all different impact areas, and we steward about 625 million pounds of money, and we can talk a little bit more about where that's come from if that's interesting for people, but I'll move past that for now. We're a fund of funds, which means that the market building aspect of what we do is really important. Effectively, we wholesale capital through other investment funds and platforms to then go on and achieve the impact through other impactful organizations in one way or another. Now, and everything on the investment side of what we do is actually investment. We must make returns. We're not a grant making organization or a foundation from that point of view, and we're there to build a sustainable market. Now, our market building mandate means that what we are effectively trying to do is bring others alongside us in everything that we do as well. So you'll see some of that come out in one of the ways. So the partner angle, hopefully, is really around some of that stuff. And as I said, we're impact agnostic, but where we sit on the spectrum of different types of impact, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the impact frontiers, avoid harm, benefit stakeholders, and contribute solutions. We're really set up to play in that third category of things, which is really around contributing, helping to contribute solutions to some of the big challenges and solving some of those challenges across the UK. And we're dedicated to some of that, whether that's, as you see in some of these examples, tackling homelessness through property funds that are looking to provide transitional accommodation for those on the edge of homelessness, or through financial inclusion or mental health through an organization like WageStream that sits in one of our venture portfolios, which is tech that's giving workers financial freedom that allows them to access cash as they earn it. That's kind of the cutting edge of the solutions and solving challenges to those big problems where all of our money is dedicated to going in. As we look at our investment approach then to try and do some of this stuff, again, I'm not going to go through this, but I think there's a couple of things to pull out here. What we're dealing with is not one market. So the impact investing or social impact investing market is not one thing. And in response to that, we don't bring one type of capital. So although we steward 625 million pounds that sits on our balance sheet in one way or another, it's how we engage with that differently using the various tools that are available, which is where we start to see where we can play the biggest role and have the biggest impact. Within every deal that we do, there are three key considerations. One, as I said, it's around the financial returns. Where does that stack up in terms of what we're trying to achieve around, in terms of the long-term sustainability of the model? Two, it's the impact either on people or on the enterprises that we're serving. And then three, there's a consideration around the systems change potential. And I know that this area of creating deeper systems transformation, systems change is one that's increasingly on the agenda. That's absolutely at the heart of the kind of development of the market that we're really trying to see and that we consider every time. And not every deal we do has to live up to perfect on each of those. And so we can use the whole portfolio to create some of that mix. And as I just reflected, that there's not one market and there's not one type of capital. There are four broad product types or asset classes that we invest across, and they're there on that page. There's property, venture, lending, and what we call social outcomes contracts, which used to be social impact bonds. They're pay for success models in one way or another. Again, I'll leave that there and we can get into that in more detail in due course, but I'll keep going. And I guess the question here is how are we doing? How are we getting on? We've been around since 2012. This is slightly out of date, this slide, but effectively, as at year end 2023, there's been about 663 million invested. So that's not committed, that's actual money that's gone out the door from us. And then total, including us, but alongside those partner investors that we try and bring, that's now at 2.6 billion. So in effectively just over 10 years, we've managed to fully deploy our money once, and it's started to come back. And so that's allowing us to do the same again over the next period of time, and crowding in that others, the market size and the potential of what that's able to be achieved, as a consequence of that, which is really our mission, is growing as well. And I think on this, there's so much more than just investment that we do here. We play a role, we have as part of that market building mandate, capital is crucial and it's our main tool, but we're also doing a whole bunch of other stuff. So to give a few examples, that could be collaborating to set up information platforms. There's one called Good Finance we've done with social sector organizations and their navigation of the space, providing non-financial support to our fund managers, how they can help strengthen themselves, become more sustainable, learning best practice, or giving them insights on market areas that they're playing in. Whether it's on the government side, lobbying to create policy change in one way or another. For example, one thing I'll come on to talk about is some of our guarantees work in one way or another. How we've helped shape some of what those guarantees look like and what they're for with government. That kind of interaction with policy, public affairs, and shaping some of those enabling conditions has been a really big part of what we do as well. And there's a few other pieces there as well. So capital is part of the toolkit, but there's others alongside that helps us achieve some of the success. And some of that success to date has seen the market grow effectively tenfold in the years that we've been in operation in one way or another. I'm going to keep going for a couple of reasons, just because I want to get through to the blended finance part. There's some general lessons here, and we can get into some of those really around our approach, how we work with others and mobilizing a movement, and then how we really focus on building the organization and the people to deliver against mission. But what we're really talking about today is blended finance, and increasingly, and how we use this as a tool amongst others and a way of investing that we think can close a few significant gaps in that challenges in the UK space that is that dedicated area where our investment goes. I'll just give a very brief one or two notes on some of the definitions and how we use them, just in case that's helpful. And I'll talk about blended finance, catalytic capital, and the concessionary element and angle of some of that stuff. So when we talk about blended finance, what we're really talking about is exactly how it was described up front, where you have a range of different types of capital or financial tools that are pooled together in order to achieve an outcome in one way or another. So whether that's using grants or guarantees or tax reliefs or various things, that mix, that structured capital, then going out to frontline organizations in one way or another, that's where we're playing that role. When we talk about catalytic capital, we are almost everything that we do as a market builder is catalytic. And for us, that doesn't necessarily need to have, although often it does, a concessionary element in terms of risk or return. So I think a lot of groups talk about catalytic as always having a concessionary element, that sometimes for us that does, other times it doesn't. And we've got examples of how we think about the concessionary element in different ways as we play a role around some of that stuff. But almost everything that we're doing is trying to catalyze the growth of the market, and some of that stuff involves us taking a slightly different approach. So that's how we distinguish our blended finance language from our catalytic language, just in case that's not clear enough in some of the stuff I'm saying next. So when we think about blended finance, the key element here for us is the role that this kind of creating these kind of structures can bridge gaps that exist between the capital sources and the size of amount of capital that's needed to address some of the challenges, and bridge that into the organizations that are creating the impact on the ground. And so we see this as a two-sided bridge, and that's really important for us when we think about the different interventions and the different ways that we bring different types of capital together to address those needs. So on the one hand, you've got investor requirements in various ways, and they could be from foundations all the way through to commercial return-seeking capitals in different ways. You've then got the frontline organizations who, again, depending on the markets they're playing in, might need a different set of finance to be able, or a different set of support, or a different level of risk return to be applied to them in various ways in order to access the kind of products. And so when we look at what we're trying to do in different areas, it's both sides of that bridge, helping investors walk across to the structures and helping the structures then apply the products into the front line. So that's there. And there's a brief timeline. I won't go through some of that stuff, but I can pick out some examples in various ways. There are three main blended finance tools we've used in the UK so far. One is guarantee schemes. The second is the grant and concessional capital angle, which often comes in as first loss alongside others, or applies in specific ways at the front line as technical assistance or as bridging gaps in various ways. And there's also tax reliefs. A couple of just quick examples to bring this to life. In the grant and concessional capital, and this is really where we started with some of our blended finance exploration back in 2014, 2015, just after I joined BSc. There was a gap in the market that we, with our existing approach at that time, really weren't able to address, which was the sub 100K loans to bread and butter social enterprises and charities in the UK. And so we needed to iterate the model between the kind of funds that we were providing and and the products that they were providing to that group in order to expand the access. So we worked with a really major foundation in the UK called the National Lottery Community Fund in order to allow some of that stuff to happen in one way or another. And I think that was bear with me one second. My daughter's just come into the room. Give me 1 second. Sorry, she's on a play date. That's real life happening in action. So we pooled together the first loss, effectively capital of the community foundation, of the community fund, with our loan capital in order to create a series of products that allowed us to change the dial and shift that mix of what was able to target. And it's been incredibly insightful and successful in terms of the lessons that's provided us. And we've reached over 700 organizations, or kind of between 600 and 700 organizations through that model. And the average loan in that space is now at 65, 67K, something like that. Whereas before it was in the 250K space. So it's really shifted the market in one way or another. So that was where we started, and that was how we've used some of this stuff, really focusing on that product mix. One absolute critical piece whenever you're engaging in some of this blended finance work is really around the partnership working and that partnership lessons and that understanding. So there's a really interesting dynamic, and one of the key roles that we play is often a bit of a translation engine between organizations coming from one part of the sector with organizations coming from another. So your traditional grant making foundations in one way or another, with whom we have lots in common, and your traditional investment or asset manager in one way or another, or asset owner with another part of with another set of cultures, and our ability to collaborate and bring some of those pieces together in order to allow the greater impact to be reached, I think, is one thing that increasingly at different points in time we've found that has been difficult to overcome, and then we've seen moves been made in other parts in other parts and with other partners to really bridge some of those gaps in one way or another, and also using different of those catalytic tools that we talked about in blended finance. So guarantees versus where you use first loss and grant and concessional versus where you use tax reliefs to bridge some of those gaps slightly differently and bring some of that stuff to life. So another example which has combined a couple of those, which is really interesting for us, is the Recovery Loan Fund, which is run by a manager called the Social Investment Business, or SIB. They post some of the COVID crisis, there was a lot of iteration in the guarantees that were able to be applied for social sector organisations in the UK. And they benefited from some of that stuff and applied that in the fund, which allowed them to raise different types of investment capital, and that changed the mix and the risk profile. It effectively covered up to about 75% of the portfolio losses. They then, as SIB, the organisation, put equity in to allow them both to generate the upside and the learnings, but also to create an extra additional buffer and layer for some of those investors. But then we also got a specific amount of concessional grant funding that then allowed them to change the mix for organizations with minoritized founders or working in a specific space in one way or another, that then has changed the mix of who they're able to have in their portfolio hugely. So they've been able to raise more investment capital into the structure and provide more appropriate returns for what they're looking for, risk return balance. And then they've also been able to bridge that and target a set of groups who previously never been able to access that. And the shift has been huge in practice in terms of particularly what that second element has done when you're operating intentionally in that space. So the first fund through COVID had about 4% applications and organizations flowing through from those groups, from minoritized groups in one way or another. The second fund is now up at 25% in terms of applications and actual money flowing out of the door. So the shift has been huge just from making more appropriate products for that group based on lessons learned. And I think they're learning even more about how they might bridge that gap even further in one way or another, which is really helping us with some of the reach objectives and some of those access to capital. I'm really conscious of time and we can get into the conversation. I just want to finish on this final piece. And this is basically where are the ways that we are currently thinking about applying blended finance to our market building activity, and how do we think about that differently in different ways? And there's effectively 4 categories here. One is in our seeding work, one is in our sustaining work. And so seeding is those really early areas, which nobody's quite sure whether there's a market there or not. It entails high risk in terms of some of that stuff, and blended finance is needed to shift that balance. Sustaining is really that access growth fund pot that I talked about before, which is that where the National Lottery Fund and us collaborated, where there is a market, but actually it's always going to be sub-commercial returns, and it just needs sustaining in various ways in order for those organizations to continue to create the impact that they're going to be having over time. There's then 2 other ways that we've started to see the market shift in one way or another, and these are segments of the market which are scaling up. So there's a much bigger market out there, but the capital that's needed in order to address some of those challenges is huge. And this is some of our community development finance institution investments, or CDFI, so small and medium-sized enterprise lending in really deprived areas of the UK. That's one of those areas we're starting to see some of that take off. Or in the scaling out section, where ultimately we don't believe there's a need for blended finance. But as the scaling grows, blended finance is needed as a part of that journey to help it get to that scale, which then allows it to be market, which allows other investors to take over and create that impact without some of these models. And with that in mind, we can get into loads of those deep points of detail. Apologies for the interruption earlier. They were very excited, presumably by some of the stuff that we're talking about today. And I'll finish there. hopefully that made sense. And I'll stop sharing as well so we can get into a conversation round.
Thank you so much, James, and please don't apologize. I love the comment in the chat that your daughter is one of the next great impact leaders, which is true. So she's welcome to join as we chat further today. So first off, just thank you for those really interesting and helpful insights. This is the perfect time to be having this conversation in Canada, or continuing it rather, on the back of a few events we've had recently. Catalytic capital is just gaining steam year after year, but the practicalities of how you do it, who you do it with, is really what I think a lot of us are grappling with right now. And it's really interesting to me to continuously see Canada, albeit in Canada, we're at a slightly or very, very much earlier stage of our own journey. We have some social finance wholesalers represented on this call, and I think that's really fascinating to see and to hear your experience and how it might translate for us as we really kick off with our own market building journey here in Canada. I mean, the first question, you've really touched on some of this at a high level already, but I'd love to hear more about what types of investment approaches and tools you found to be most effective in making finance more accessible. And on that too, what can we learn from transactions you've made that have managed to achieve their impact goals? It's great to see that you have some second iterations, the Recovery Loan Fund being an example. What could you point to that has really managed to achieve their impact goals over time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's one we continually reflect on in various ways. And some of us reflect our reflections on things that haven't worked so well also feed into some of this in one way or another. I think where it works, some of this where it works best in terms of the deep impact into some of those objectives is where it is done in collaboration with other partners, in terms of the understanding of the gaps that are needed to be filled. So I'll just come back to that example. So it was not by chance that the products that were identified and the ways that those different bits of finance were patched together came about. They had a number of consultations between first fund and second fund around this objective of getting reach into more diverse communities and diverse sets of business leaders, and partnered with an organization whose role and whose community effectively with these type of organizations in order to help shape some of that stuff. So it was a really intentional process of what the finance needed to look like, but also what the process needed to be to overcome some of those blockers. So sometimes as investors, you go, oh, I'll just put out this product, it'll be great, because we've got investment and that's our tool. And actually you go, oh, why is no one taking this up? It's cheap capital, I don't really understand it. And you might find, and you find along that process that, oh, there's a barrier here around just getting the business plan together, or around knowing who the fund managers, knowing where the pipeline is around some of those sorts of things. So intentionally designing from ground up to meet some of those problems has been where that's been most successful. And I think that's one example of some of that stuff. The other one, in terms of to give a very different example, is from our Fair by Design portfolio. So this is on our, again, it's on our ventures portfolio. It's our ventures side of our work in that sense, just to show how some of this stuff works overall. And the partner who is involved in some of that alongside us is one of the UK's leading experts in tackling poverty, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who brings that expertise of the end customer effectively, as well as the different business models that may be there already or that could be addressed around some of that stuff, and intentionally designing some of the strategy to meet some of those from where they've had. So I think that answers both parts of your question, where the product being designed, but also then the delivery mechanism and how you go about some of that approach is often equally important around some of that stuff.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the key differences with big society capital, and where where I think the innovation really lies is obviously the focus on social impact. Saw in Impact Alpha last week a bit of a review of blended finance to date, Catalytic Capital, that the most of the scaled opportunities are really in the climate space. So I'd love to learn more about an approach help address social inequalities often found in the traditional finance system, and how has Catalytic Capital really helped with that?
So it's you broke up a little bit, Wren, but I think what I understood, just to play that back, was the the role in environmental climate markets around blended finance and some of that stuff, and what we're learning from some of those kind of areas and how that plays out. Is that right?
So it was actually we see so much blended capital happening in the climate
Okay.
space, but given
Yeah.
big society capital's focus on social impact,
Yeah.
really the question about how your investing approach has helped to address social inequalities often found in the traditional finance system. And I apologize for my internet connection.
Yeah. No. So yeah, I got you now. So I think there's two or three intentional ways we approach some of this stuff. There's one which is there's one which is by looking at ourselves and our own practices within some of this stuff. So looking at how we operate, looking at the kind of policies and processes in place, looking at some of the our hiring practices and some of that sort of thing. So that's the kind of closest to home part of it. And part of that is how we're using our how we're shaping our strategy, where we see some of the need and where we see some of that gap, and then pointing in that direction. The second layer of some of that stuff is our closest partners, and the people who we either work with in through our investing practices, so our fund managers, co-investors alongside us in various ways, influencing some of them. So things we've done, for example, is we've put people on investment committees around who aren't traditionally seen on investment committees in one way or another. So we've got a program called Investment Committees of the Future. So often one of the barriers in people making decisions to invest in certain types of organizations is they have no understanding of those organizations and some of their practices in various ways. So we've established some of that in some of our funds around that, and again hoping to role model that through time in one way or another. I think part of that as well is but by sharing some of that stuff with our co-investors on that journey, they then are in other funds around some of that stuff. So there is a ripple effect. So part of us growing that market and being a leader isn't that over time we're in more things. It's actually that more things are happening away from us that have some of our fingerprints in, whether it directly or indirectly. And so the third part of that as well is really around the influencing tools that we can have in one way or another. So being part of wider communities of practice, whether it's with through things like just transition groups, whether it's with on UK government panels in one way or another, whether it's with groups of foundations, or with the Impact Investing Institute and the people they're convening, and sharing some of these things out in various ways. That starts to play a role in doing some of that stuff. And actually, to come back to where your question started, one of the things we've been doing for the last year is building a blended finance community of practice, which is really trying to pull together people who are interested from across the spectrum of capital and who are doing some of this stuff, and learning those lessons that they're taking. And often they are coming from either international and development finance world, but then also from the climate space, and bringing those together with partners who are focused more close to home. Because actually some of the issues and some of the way that plays out on the ground might be different, there's more in common through some of this stuff for sure than there is that divides us. And we've been in our developed market that has a lot of development that's needed within it. We just haven't engaged in the same way and learned some of those lessons. And so some of that stuff's happening. We've got a second annual conference. It's not really an annual conference, but it's an event that's happening next week where we're focusing on use of blended finance to achieve systems change and lessons that people have learned in various ways. It's a 2-day thing that's happening, and we're oversubscribed at 100 people in central London. So there's some interesting things that we'll then try and build momentum around from the back of that we're creating education and information, a community of people who know who else is interested in some of this space, who've done it or who want to do it, and then of practice. So we're actually then going and taking up from the areas of momentum where there might be a working group that we can build around a business model and go, look, how do we create impact together in various ways by scaling some of this stuff up?
Amazing. I love just so much of what you've shared about the depth of expertise and kind of forming investment solutions from various experts cross-sector, working and partnership building, the challenges associated with that, but also kind of the key essence of making these models successful depends on bringing in those experts from different fields and building solutions from there. There's so many excellent questions coming in from the audience, so I'm just going to ask one more of mine, and then we'll turn right over to audience questions, because that's really what we're here for. The final question would be, what's possible now that wasn't possible 5 years ago? Where do you see kind of the huge trends, trajectories? What are you able to do now as a wholesaler that wasn't possible before?
So yeah, so I think there's many things, but I think there's probably 2 or 3 that I'll just pick on real quick, and then let's get into these questions. So one is genuinely there's a different appetite for some of this stuff that we're seeing from investors from different parts of the spectrum in various ways. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's happening. People are seeing the challenges in front of them, and they're needing more capital, and they realize they have to do something about some of that stuff. Some of it is around credibility of this space. I shared some of how much we've done in that space. There are models that are working around this, and some people just take a little bit of time to look at some of that track record and go, okay, right, there is something here and it's real, and how we can do some of that stuff. And then there's probably a little bit of, the enabling environment is frankly just different. So I talked about some of those guarantee schemes that actually, COVID 5 years ago, when COVID hit, there was a small lending guarantees scheme that we were using around the margins for some of that CDFI work I alluded to earlier. COVID really changed the way that the UK government, because often in the UK context, it's the government who has been providing the guarantee schemes in various ways. Whereas I know in the US and probably some other jurisdictions, foundations in various ways have played some of that role. So again, there's different ways that we could have approached some of that stuff. But when COVID hit and they expanded the guarantee schemes, actually the opportunity in that moment was to ensure that charities, social enterprises, and more impactful organizations fell within the eligibility of that guarantee scheme, and then through that period started to prove out that they were equally credible in terms of what they were offering, in terms of what they were delivering. And so that then has changed the game for how much money we can scale into some of those sectors. So we've recently just announced kind of a second phase of the CDFI work, where Lloyds Banking Group, which is one of the main 4 UK high street banks, has come in alongside us using the latest iteration of this guarantee scheme, and they've put almost 70 million pounds to work alongside us into just 3 of these CDFIs. So we're starting to then see that as a means of scale. And in the first one, we put 30 in, and other more socially motivated banks put 30 in. So we're already seeing that mix and what we're able to lever in scale at just the second fund because of this kind of thing. And that's been repeated in a number of different areas. So I'd say, yeah, those 3 things.
And I think that's really fascinating about bringing in private high street bank financing. I think we don't quite see that yet in Canada, but we're hopeful it's around the corner. How, I guess, moving into how philanthropic capital also works alongside those other pools. There's a question from Wayne. Can you share how pooled guarantee funds, pooled first loss capital funds, et cetera, are working in the UK? What is the role of philanthropic capital alongside BSC's repayable capital to enable these types of pooled shared models to operate?
So in many ways, they are absolutely fundamental. So we started in the UK sort of ecosystem working alongside, in our blended finance, working alongside philanthropic capital providers. So I mentioned the National Lottery Community Fund. That is a entirely philanthropic foundation who provides grants, and they were crucial alongside us in having that first loss model to the underlying fund managers that could access that pool in various ways. So the availability of the capital and what was there just allowed that model to be, that was very much in the innovative seed phase, and we did it at scale from the first iteration because the availability of that capital was there to test something where we believed there was a model, and that we started to prove out over time. So the ability of that to be there. Now, when we then look at wider parts of the ecosystem in various ways that exist, there are pockets of some of that stuff that's being repeated, where we, some of the dynamics have shifted through time a little bit, which and I think some of the philanthropic founders in the UK particularly want to target specific impacts, and so they often play at that now. They play at the later stage, or the kind of the bridging into communities or bridging into those organizations, and change the product mix. So effectively, so they're less about, it's not always the case, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but they're less about pooling it into the fund itself, and more around, here's a bit of capital that will help target these specific impacts in one way or another. So the model I alluded to before, just because it's front of center around the recovery loan fund, and shifting that pay dynamic in one way, or the product mix dynamic in one way or another, that allowed it to go to be, and specifically what that was they were smaller ticket sizes, so they were allowed anything sub 50k versus the previous model. It was the time that they were allowed to be paid back in, so extending the term, and they bore some of the returns, so they had cheaper capital as well. So it was the combination of those three things over and above some of the process bits where that happened. So we're still seeing some of that mix, and we're still seeing some of that thing. Now, the barriers to some of that stuff, there is a genuine tension a little bit about the mindset of, why would I just subsidize private capital to come in around some of this stuff when I want to when effectively they should be taking some more of that risk around some of that stuff. And where we see some of that attitude, we see more barriers coming through, where we see an attitude of, actually, I want to create end impact in one way or another. And how do we use our catalytic capital to bring other organizations into the space, and effectively do anywhere 3, 5, 10 times as much capital flowing to the impact we really care about, and then working in partnership with those organizations to understand that position. That's where we see some of the more dynamic discussions around blended finance and what they really can catalyze. So but every organization is starting from a very different point in time, in our experience, and have different boards, trustees, decision-making bodies that are more or less comfortable with operating with one mindset or the other. And for us, it's about working with those who are aligned, creating track records for some of that stuff, and then working out where some of that stuff goes. A bit long-winded, but hopefully that hits some of the notes.
No, super, super helpful. I mean, a more practical question, I guess, building off of pooled fund structure and understanding expectations around returns. And one participant asked, have any of the returns surprised you with the funds you funded, higher or lower? We're also equally interested in what hasn't worked, so that we can obviously learn from both what's gone well and what could be improved.
Yeah, really interesting question. Yes is the answer. So some of the, and where the stuff that's typically been lower has been because it's less around the anything to do with the underlying dynamics, the structuring, any of that sort of thing. It's more to do with just basic credit risk, and taking too much of that in an organization that you that hasn't ended up working for one reason or another. So there's funds where there's been loads of track record previously, and then one or two organizations within the model have just fallen over, and there hasn't been enough of the downside capital to balance some of that stuff, and we've been caught out a little bit because that was available somewhere else and we hadn't structured for some of that stuff. So there's definitely lessons around, you know, how you still invest and work with these organizations with rigor in various ways and understand some of the risks you're going in, and you play a role around structuring and patching some of the different types of finance to meet some of that stuff that builds up a track record over time. So that's more typically on the downside. On the upside, there's been a few. So, you know, some of our funds through COVID, for example, which were really making use of that first guarantee fund, we thought we would absolutely be losing money on, even though we thought it was the right thing for us to do. And we moved quickly without co-investors in those emergency situations. Actually, because of the way that the guarantee worked in practice, some of those models came through COVID in various ways with more strength than we predicted in various ways. We're going to make a bit of a return on that and return that more quickly. So there's angles where I think when you are moving, you know, some of those are really around where you are surprised by the pace of how quickly things move, or where policy environments change in one way or another. You know, there's elements of that which have been really positive. Now, a big challenge for us, and this is real, and it's probably not within your question, but otherwise, is, you know, the first 10 years of everything we did at BSC was in a very different returns environment. In terms of the interest rates, inflation, and everything else that you might be seeing in the macro world, that I know is being experienced in a number of different geographies, than it is today. And what that effectively means is two things, really. One, you know, the investor appetite around some of that stuff and what they can get for relative risk impact return, the kind of the various things that we look at, has shifted and has just changed quite drastically. And then secondly, the role, therefore, of, you know, the various combinations of the blended finance to meet and bridge some of those gaps that works for organizations that are under more strain at the front line and investors who have higher returns. It means that in some areas, the business models or the markets that we thought would work with this kind of model aren't working anymore, or there's a bigger gap to bridge, to reuse that language and analogy. And that's just there's a bit of a reality of some of that stuff. And so equally, there are other areas that are becoming more opportunities in various ways along the lines of some of that stuff. So it's not quite the same question, but I think it's getting along to some of that stuff in various ways.
No, and this is where I think we need 3 hours, because I want to dive into so many different examples of that you've highlighted so far. And I think that point around being responsive to the macro and social environment, and really being responsive to the social needs you're trying to address at any given time, to your example around COVID related funding pools, that is just so critical, especially as a social finance wholesaler, and the way you can catalyze those different pools of capital in really strenuous times, I think, has been particularly inspiring and something we can learn from. On shared learnings, a question from Alex on how do you see the knowledge sharing collaboration around understanding blended finance working, as in what does BSC do? Obviously, you're here today, it's an example, but not only sharing information about models and mechanisms, but also sharing impact measurement data, for example, and kind of the impact measurement, or impact successes, rather, of some of the models you've trialed and seen succeed.
So yeah, it's the really good questions. And, you know, we're, to an extent, you know, we feel the tension quite a lot between some of the, you know, the market and the mission that we have for the UK specifically, and then also you know, that we don't exist in a solitary ecosystem within the UK, that actually we can benefit internationally from learning shared in, and also be part of that wider conversation, and that will then feed around and benefit us. There's a few ways we are doing this. There's absolutely more we can do and get better on that, not least just to make the most of the insights that we do have in general, because I think that is one area where 10 years in, probably we haven't got to the level of depth and sophistication of what those insights are telling us and how we can get them, that we probably should actually. And I think that's, that's something that we're working on in terms of, and particularly our sweet spot around the sustainable business models that exist to create X, Y, and Z impact and how they're comparing through time. We've got a ton of stuff that we could get at through some of that stuff with a bit more work and a bit more different angles on the team, but it's around prioritization of some of that stuff. So that's one kind of admission on that to begin with. But we are engaged through things like the Global Impact Investing Network, the GIN work in various ways on some of that stuff, and we share various lessons. At various of the conferences, we pulled together a number of things where we shared case studies into some of that stuff, particularly around this blended finance work and some of the stuff that's being done around that. We also do, we have through the community of practice, we're doing some of that stuff. So that first whole pillar was around education and info sharing. We've got about probably about 8 to 10 different case studies of the various blended funds, of which we've got more than that we've written up for some of that audience and forum. And then there will be a site at one point in time where all of those, from not just us, but from all of the other collaborating partners, goes on in various ways. We're just trying to get some of that stuff set up. So there is that kind of piece around some of that stuff, and that will include some of those. And then some of the specific examples, they're really good at telling their own story and having some of that impact piece in various ways. So again, the fund I keep coming back to, just because for consistency point of view, the RLF, they've got incredible dashboard data around in-flight impact they're creating, who they're reaching in various ways. And part of that transparency of, the transparency of market is one of the things that, within our mandate, trying to help trying to grow. One thing we're not so good at, because we're impact agnostic and we do everything, is being able to aggregate all of that and tell a really coherent story, because it's so hard to do when you've got a tiny little fund looking at a small community level investment in one thing or another versus a massive property fund doing X, Y, and Z, of which we have different stakes in, and then tell that as a coherent, aggregated, comparable impact story. So we try and let those things stand alone on their own. It's not necessarily the best approach, but it's one that is the choice that we've been making at the moment. But yeah, it's a really great question, and yeah, love to share more.
We're almost out of time. I think the final few questions are rolling in, and I'm sure everyone would love to follow up with many others. But from us, thinking of where we're at on our own journey in Canada, could you leave us with a few tidbits of advice? Where would you say we should continue building our approach in this space? What are the 2 or 3 key lessons you could leave us with today?
So I think the first one is really the stuff that you're doing. So it's do more, there is momentum around some of this space, and absolutely convening some of these things and learning those lessons and seeing what's happening. It's what we're finding in our own community of practice, which is not just UK, but kind of close partners in various ways that exist. That as a pool of learning lessons, sharing some of that stuff, getting moral encouragement through some of the hard. So creating that community is super important around some of that stuff. The second one is doing things in practice really helps bring to life, because we can talk and theorize all day around this model or that model and how this might work and this mechanism, some of those sorts of things. But until you have some of those examples that you're doing yourselves in various ways, so dive, and part of the blended finance, the beauty of blended finance is it allows for a little bit more experimentation if you structure it the right way with the right type of capital. So you can move, and with Catalytic capital, you can move sooner than you would otherwise be moving. So I would absolutely take this to action. And that, one of the mantras we had as BSC, where we had all this money on our balance sheet, and was taking us a while to invest, was really that bias to action. So in this space, as much as ever, really having that bias to action. And the third thing is really focus on what is, the shared goals whenever you're going into some of this stuff, rather than what divides you. Because I think there is way more in common around what you're trying to achieve, even if you're coming from a different point of view or a different way of working. often the crowding more capital into a space to create more impact, there's a shared understanding, even if the tools that we're all bringing to the table are very different. So those would be my three little pieces of advice. Hopefully that's helpful and isn't just teaching you to do things you already know. But
no, incredibly helpful. And I think going back to where you started, James, emphasizing that it's not just about the capital, as useful as that is, it's about the entirety of the wraparound support, non-financial included, that you provide. I think that's just such an important lesson for us as we take forward this community of practice to really build out some of these lessons in practice in the Canadian market. So just thank you so much again for your time. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with Big Society Capital as you continue on your journey, and us from our side as well. So Christy, back to you, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to reiterate Wren's thank yous to you, James, for coming and spending some time with us. I feel like it wasn't enough. You can see from the list of questions and from how people are really interested in digging into not only like the structure and the functions of how these things work, but also the underlying principles and values and relationships and collaborations that make it all work. So I'm left with, some of those tensions around, how much do we use public capital or concessionary capital to unlock private capital? Like how do we balance measurement? What are outcomes? Like these are really big questions that we're all grappling with. And so to have your conversation and add into, I'd say a slightly more advanced social finance ecosystem, which is in the UK, as we're growing and building and strengthening ours here in Canada. So appreciate it. I kind of am left with that feeling of how do we do more and learn more. And I think that's the part of why we're doing this blended capital conversation series, is to tap into what's already existing. What are the lessons learned? And then how do we bring that home into Canada and do more here? So a big thank you to you, James. A big thank you to you, Wren, for hosting the conversation and managing and looking at everything that was coming in from the chat and being present for James. I really appreciate that. And finally, not finally, I just also really want to thank everybody who turned up and contributed. We are going to capture those questions, as Keith put into the chat. We'll capture the questions that come out and continue to roll up, like where is there energy and curiosity and steps that we want to dig in together as a social finance community in this country to continue to move forward in this work. And so you'll see following this, a recording sent out. We'll have those questions done. We'll send a link to Ani Patton Power's recording as well. Someone had asked about that, so we're happy to share that as well, and a link to those too. And finally to Keith and Tracy and the Spring team and the Thrive team and the Ontario Trillium Foundation team for supporting this work. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.